I think one of the reasons that whoever is responsible for the scandal at RTE over payments should be ashamed of themselves is because for 3 or 4 weeks now it has sucked all the air out of every other issue that is affecting ordinary people in this country who are often really struggling with intense hardship and difficulties in their lives. And one of the issues before this all finishes at the end of this week for the summer recess that has undoubtedly, if you like, been overshadowed by, certainly it's an important issue, don't get me wrong, what's happening in RTE, but tragically it has overshadowed, I think, a crisis that is really the most acute crisis we continue to face. And that is the fact that we now have more families and children and individuals homeless in this state than we have ever had on record. 12,441, including 3,699 children, shamefully. And thousands and thousands more who are facing the possibility of homelessness because of the government's decision to lift the eviction ban and its failure to put in place alternatives to provide public housing, affordable housing, or some alternative to the possibility of being evicted when you've done absolutely nothing wrong. And I just feel compelled to remind the government and indeed the media on this last week of the Dáil that these issues need to be addressed and not forgotten as we head into the summer. The residents of Tahaney House were going to come in here today, but to be honest, they are just so stressed and so depressed about their situation, they couldn't even bring themselves to come in at the last minute because their landlord is evicting them and on grounds of sale. And despite the tenant in situ policy, Dublin City Council has contacted that landlord and he's just ignored all contact from the council about the possibility of buying the apartment complex to stop those people being evicted. Now, the government said that they were going to bring in a first refusal policy to deal with what, on the face of it, is a landlord who is cruel and inhumane. Doesn't care about the stress, the hardship, the fear, the terror that the families in Tahaney House are suffering. I've just heard of another case out in Swords of 47 homes who are being evicted now, apparently on the grounds that their Part 4 tenancies are over, and this is a grounds for eviction. And we are also hearing all over the place of councils finding excuses for not purchasing properties where families are faced with eviction, the latest one being the fact that there are management fees in multi-unit complexes, and that's a reason. Now, what I'm asking, Count Corla, is that the government will, as an emergency measure, reinstate the eviction ban, bring in the first refusal policy as an emergency piece of legislation, and address the anomalies in the tenant in situ scheme to prevent more families being made homeless over the summer.
Thanks, Deputy. We had a Cabinet meeting today. I think there were 67 items on the agenda, and I can absolutely guarantee you that more of those items were about housing than about RTE, and we as a government spend a lot more time concerned about the housing crisis than we do about RTE, important as that issue is, and I can give you that reassurance. I'm happy to reassure you of that. In relation to housing, this morning government published our Q2 2022 report, the progress that's being made to put right the housing crisis in this country, which is deep, which is affecting people in lots of different ways, and showed that the number of new homes being built is up, number of commencements is up, number of planning permissions up 40%. On the same time last year, Q1. The pipeline is very strong. 700 first-time buyers getting mortgage approval every week now, the highest since records began. Roughly 400 or 500 first-time buyers now every week, the highest in maybe 15 years. And more social housing being built than any time since 1975. And we're increasingly confident that we will beat and exceed our housing targets for this year. That's 29,000 new homes, plus student accommodation, plus derelict homes being brought back into use. And we announced today a new fund of €150 million to enable more local authorities to buy properties, refurbish them for residential purposes, sell them on, and then use that money again to buy other properties. So a lot of progress is being made, but I don't for a second argue that it's enough or that there isn't a lot more that we need to do. And the really dark end, the most difficult end of the housing crisis is, of course, homelessness. It's the fact that there are roughly 12,000 people being provided with state-provided emergency accommodation at the moment. And we are helping in lots of different ways. Ramping up social housing, like I mentioned earlier, Homeless HAP to help people find a place in the private market sector, and also the tenant in situ scheme, about 2,000 properties in process now to be purchased by the government from landlords, so that people living in those properties can become regular social housing tenants, something I know you support and advocated for many times, something that's now really happening at scale. And I don't know why it can't be done in Tantalny House. I'll look into that, but I definitely think that is a potential solution. And we are lifting more people out of homelessness than ever before. That figure is rarely talked about or published. More people being lifted out of homelessness by governments than ever before. Unfortunately, there are many reasons why people become homeless, and they're not always under the control of government. Family breakdown, increasingly people from overseas, non-citizens. 40% of emergency accommodation is now people who are not Irish citizens, many of whom are not even entitled to social housing. So it's a much more complicated picture than many would suggest. In relation to your question on the eviction ban, we don't intend to reinstate it. When it was in place, it didn't work. The number of people in emergency accommodation went up nearly every month that was in place. Yes, it's continued to rise since then, but still at a similar rate. People argue this, but 1 or 2% a month. We obviously want to see it going the other way, but it didn't work.
Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Taoiseach, promises of things in the future are cold comfort to families who are homeless now, in many cases for several years, with their kids, or those who are threatened with homelessness immediately. I had a woman in with me this week who was bawling, crying in our office because she felt she'd let her daughter down. She's working, by the way, as many who are homeless or threatened with homelessness are. And the problem with what you've just said is you've no solution for her and her children and for many others. I raised with you last week a woman who's, again, working for a state agency, 4 years in homeless accommodation, but can't afford the rents out there and is over the threshold for social housing, so there's nothing for her. Rotting in homeless accommodation. And then we have, and I support the tenant in situ scheme, I indeed advocated for its establishment, but there are councils around the country who are looking for every excuse not to do it. The latest one is because there's management fees. And then you have another council who says that's not a problem, management fees, and then you have a council saying no, that's a reason for not doing it. And we have asked you, and I asked at the Business Committee, that the government would address these things before the summer recess. Because real individuals, not statistics, families and children, will end up homeless over the summer months if they are not addressed as a matter of urgency.
Thanks, Deputy. Anybody having to spend a prolonged period in emergency accommodation is unacceptable and undesirable. But the vast majority of people who are provided with emergency accommodation by the state are there for less than a year. And for very many, it's in and around 6 or 7 months. I've come across plenty of cases of people who are there for a prolonged period of time, like 3 years, like 4 years, just like you, but there's often a more complicated story behind it. And I don't know in your case, but there are plenty of cases now in my constituency where people who are in emergency accommodation for 2 years and 3 years have turned down multiple offers of accommodation. That might not be the case in your case, but it is the case, and we should factor that into our statistics as well, because it's not the case that all those 12,000 people have not been offered permanent accommodation. Very many have. And Deputy, in terms of the options for people who don't qualify for social housing, we have an option. It's cost rental, a new form of public housing created by the last government, being realised by this government, and it's being scaled up every day.